Well, hello everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm joined by my co-host Peter Lavelle from Moscow and Jeremy Nell from Cape Town, and by our two guests, Mark Sleboda, also from Moscow, and George Samueli from Budapest. We are meeting, everyone's been on the show many times before, we're meeting to discuss the latest developments in the Ukraine saga, obviously the Anchorage summit last Friday, and then the White House summit on Monday. I was in DC myself at that time. The meetings have been described as historic, and indeed I think they were historic, but perhaps not from a political point of view, more from a social psychology. The East Wing of the East Room of the White House. I was reminded of the Milgram experiments. The Milgram experiments are famous experiments where people were more or less taken off the street and told to administer electric torture to a victim in a neighboring room, and the victim was played by an actor, but the people in the experiment, a large percentage of them went along. Well, I think that this latest meeting gives us a new insight into psychological torture, because the European leaders who went to the White House, not only, unlike the people in the Milgram experiments who agreed to inflict torture, they went there to be the victims themselves of torture. And they were very willing and very happy to be tortured. They were tortured on various levels. They were tortured by Trump, who typically tortures or at least humiliates his guests. He did it really quite spectacularly as he went round the table. He said to Keir Starmer, for instance, he's doing a great job and everybody likes him, which is pretty impressive when you see that he has a 13% opinion poll rating, Keir Starmer. Then he humiliated the whole table by saying that Ursula von der Leyen has more power than all of them, which of course she does. And then the best bit was when he couldn't identify the president of Finland, who was sitting right opposite him. He said, where are you? And he was right there. And the leaders themselves then proceeded to continue with the torturing themselves this time by sucking up something rotten to Trump and saying how fabulous he was and how he'd brought about a breakthrough, when of course they had opposed, as we know, any kind of diplomacy with Russia up until the last minute. Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, saying this is our war, and then he had the chutzpah to tell Trump that he had made a breakthrough for peace. The European Union, of course, when Viktor Orban made a peace mission in July last year, rounded on him and condemned him for that. But the sort of ultimate self-humiliation came, this may be a detail in terms of the broader issue, when the rather peculiar president of Finland said, we found a solution in 1944, we the Finns. And if you look at the Armistice Treaty, the Armistice Agreement of September 1944 between the Soviet Union and Finland, it contains three elements from the combat zone. The second element is disarmament of, well, there were then still German troops in Finland, but then later it became disarmament of all Nazi formations in Finland. And the third element is the cession territory that it had won in 1940. In other words, the three elements in the solution, which the Finnish president said Finland found in 1944, are exactly the elements that Russia is now demanding from Ukraine, and which the Finnish president himself, of course, rejects. So the whole thing was totally surreal. I don't really think I can interview any of you on this, because you all know far more about it than I do. Perhaps we'll go to Mark first. What were your impressions?
Well, I mean, the thing that still comes through to me is the way that the European elite are dealing with Trump. And was recognized this transatlantic rift that grew during his first presidency. And that was a serious concern coming in. And if the chaos bomb that is Donald J. Trump was going to go off anywhere, bets were that, considering his general contempt for European liberal leaders and their hatred, even campaigning actively against him, that is where one of the places it was sure to go off. Well, they've avoided that. And that is one of absolutely humiliatingly obsequious sycophancy, where they will literally roll over on their bellies, right, and waggle their little paws in the air and just nod their heads at anything Donald Trump says when in his presence, and then try to work around him and manipulate him using, of course, people within his own administration to direct him where they want to go. But they won't confront him directly. In fact, they take the exact opposite tack. And that was on full display in D.C. I mean, it was a schoolmaster lecturing a group of students and putting each one in his place. I'm not a European citizen, but if I was, I would feel collectively humiliated for the EU by this surrender of their sovereignty and their dignity in this way. And that just continued, right? Even when they obviously completely disagree with whatever he's saying, they nod their head and say yes, and then they'll leave the room and work again.
Well, there does seem to be unanimity that Europe was humiliated. George, Politico says that this is a clever game and that the Europeans are basically licking in order to create the circumstances in which it's Putin who rejects a deal, and therefore he takes the blame, and then they can turn around to him and say, "We told you so." Is that your reading, George?
Well, it may be. I mean, I think that it's Mark described. They were fawning obsequiously before Trump. They were absolutely going against Trump's wishes, and what they're doing here is absolutely guaranteeing that there can't possibly be any agreement in Ukraine. I mean, and that's what they kept talking about: security guarantees, security guarantees, security guarantees. They know full well that Russia will reject the security guarantees in the form that they present them. I mean, there's another variant on the security guarantees which were talked about in the Istanbul Accords in 2022, in where a number of powers, including Russia and China, would provide security guarantees for Ukraine, and that there would be a consensus among the guarantors that an aggression has been committed against Ukraine, and then they would all protect Ukraine. So that was the idea, and that obviously made NATO membership. In other words, the NATO powers issue security guarantees, which means essentially Ukraine is in NATO. So they know full well that Russia will reject this, and then presumably, the war goes on. And I think Macron's post-summit comments, he's talking about the containment. We have to contain Russia. He's bringing up the sort of the hoariest slogans from the Cold War. Russia is an aggressive power directing its aggression against Europe, and we need to contain this aggression.
Yeah. But where everyone's talking about 5D chess, might the issue of security guarantees not be something that Russia might concede or appear to concede? After all, it's a negotiation and you have to give something, in the hope that a peace agreement would trigger.
John, that's something I've argued with George a number of times. So that would take care of itself. Maybe, but we went through this mantra of a ceasefire now, which of course means keep the war going on until Russia is exhausted. Then there was this discursive shift to security guarantees, and that's another propaganda point. But to both Mark and to George, even though we've discussed this for a very long time, it's very complicated, blah, blah, blah. It's really when we talk about what it actually means. What it really gets down to is sovereignty guarantees for Ukraine. And even the Russians have indirectly have actually talked about, mentioned China could be possibly involved. What the Europeans want is to continue having a garrison state against Russia. But if we go back to the idea of the indivisibility of security, how about having multiple guarantors of Ukraine's future sovereignty? That's a very different argument, but that is something that could be the basis of a peace agreement.
First, let me address something that John said. The idea that a peace agreement triggering elections could result in regime change in Ukraine. That can't happen. All the real opposition on Putsch has been banned and lustrated and pogromed and charged with treason in the country. You could have elections. You're just going to result in another Maidan leader. And Zaluzhny, for instance, is himself a committed Banderite, right? Not someone who internalized Banderism as, you know, the bedrock of the regime that he inherited, like Zelensky did. So elections in Ukraine without a physical regime change on the ground in Kiev can only result in the continuation of the regime. With regards to the security guarantees, Biden refused to give any security guarantees to Ukraine. And now suddenly Trump evidently is entertaining U.S. air power backing up European troops. This was, you know, when dropping the idea of a ceasefire and bringing this up, this is one step forward and four steps back. No peace. This will continue on the battlefield. The Europeans,
which means they're not giving up on the NATO project.
Europeans understand this, right? And the Europeans, they're not talking about containment, really. They're all talking about war. If you go to every single major European politician, and again, check the headlines, they all expect to be at war with Russia in 10 years, in 5 years, in 2 years. That's the new number that's coming up. They just want to drag this out until they feel they're ready to go to war with Russia. Not that they're making any serious signs that I can see of ramping up military induction, but that's the idea. And of course, to run out the clock.
What I would just simply say about Peter, just following up, the way the Russians frame the issue of security guarantees in Istanbul, and I'm kind of assuming that the Russians are continuing with that Istanbul process because Putin brought up security guarantees during the news conference after the Anchorage meeting. So obviously that's what he's talking about. There are historical precedents with a number of great powers issuing a guarantee. I mean, Belgium in the 19th century, number of powers were guaranteed.
Cyprus, 1963.
Exactly. That's right, Laos in 1954. So there are plenty of historical precedents. I mean, I think Russians should have emphasized this point much more during the past two and a half years. That, yeah, there are historical precedents, but what NATO is trying to do, essentially, of getting Ukraine into NATO, de facto member of NATO, is completely unacceptable. And I agree. Their diplomacy is there's no talk about, oh, let's have a meeting with Putin and Zelensky. I mean, that's all the Europeans are talking about this. The Russians aren't talking about it. They're talking about, oh, we got to continue our meetings, we've got our committees. The committees should meet, and we've got 3 different committees, and we should raise the level of the committees. Maybe we should have more senior figures of the committees. Absolutely are about to accept any of these proposals.
So why did Putin go to Anchorage?
I think, as I said, I think they wanted to emphasize to Trump what their position was. I think that was it. They just said, "Do you understand what our position is? What our arguments are?" And one has to be fair and say to Trump does have some vague understanding. I mean, if you listen to his interview, with Fox and Friends, he did have an understanding of Russia's position. He did say this: it's obviously unacceptable to them to have NATO on its borders, and he said that the idea was that Ukraine should be a buffer zone between the West and Russia. So that indicated that he has some understanding of the Russian position. That doesn't mean that it's going to get very far, but I think he has some progress from the Biden administration.
But then why is he talking about American involvement in these security guarantees and European troops?
Trump, I think, is being very.
I don't take it seriously. I don't. Okay.
Yeah, he's being very vague. I mean, it's very hard to see that Trump has made any real commitment. He's just, oh yeah, the Europeans are going to do it. Maybe we can help out. And then he goes off and telling about how fantastic American air power is. You know, we have the best technology in the world, the best air power in the world. So he's not really making any specific commitments. So I think it's just the Europeans are taking him at his word. So, oh yeah, he's definitely.
Mark, I asked you right after the Anchorage summit what your thoughts were, and you were gorging on a nothing burger, I think you wrote to me. The war continues. So is this all theater that we've been watching over the last 10 days or so?
Yeah, largely. It was a concession because Putin had previously said that, yes, I'll be glad to meet with Trump at the end when there's a deal to be signed, right? And the fact that he agreed to this under Trump's relentless pressure for a face-to-face meeting is the first step down a process. And already, even before he went to Anchorage, the U.S. was then trying to basically, through a series of media lies about Russia's position, to pressure him right now. Now, Putin did not succumb to that pressure, but in a way, he's bought into that process. He should have kept it, I think, at a normal superpower, or great power in conflict geopolitical process with real diplomacy conducted by real diplomats, not this Trumpian perform the idea that wars can be settled in these kind of New York real estate mafioso deals, in face-to-face meetings. I think it was a mistake. But even as they're engaging in that, from the Russian leadership, we're also seeing signs, I believe, that they're moving in what, in my opinion, has to be the right direction. And Lavrov, just in the last 24 hours, gave an interview where he again brought up that Ukraine's independence, right, in the early 1990s, 91, 92, neutral, not aligned, non-nuclear power, and that if they have sacrificed that position under, the direction of this West-backed putsch that seized power in the country in 2014, then they've lost the right to that sovereignty and independence. And I think let's forget what Trump thinks, because trying to psychoanalyze Trump at any given moment, I think, is an exercise in futility and really just pandering to our baser levels. No one else in the U.S., okay, J.D. Vance maybe, would agree to Russian terms, right? No one, right? Not bipartisan consensus in Congress, not the security state, not the majority of the people in Trump's own administration. The Europeans will not agree to it. The Kiev regime will not agree to it. Therefore, everything is just a game everyone is playing of manipulating Trump. Everyone, right? Putin is playing it. Putin's very, very good at pushing Trump's buttons, right? It helps that Trump has some kind of interesting respect, almost idolization of Putin, which I think was actually, if we're going to go into that psychoanalysis, I think that was on display. But he knows, right? He knows. He talked about the elections and mail-in balloting, and that's
and
how elections
happened under your presidency, Donald Trump.
And Trump immediately went off on that and declared a war on mail-in balloting. I mean, he knows how to play him. He knows how to play him better than the Europeans or a lot of the people within his own administration, I think. But that can only do so much pressure against any genuine peace, right? Any kind of peace will just be a prelude to a larger war, right? That's ultimately where all this is going. Therefore, Russia, they have the advantage now. They need to see this all the way through the end, even if that's Kiev, Lvov, and not leave the West any room to weaponize this. And there is the hope that that one of the big fears of the West is that this is existential for them because U.S.-led Western global hegemony is on the line. Why? Because they've put it on the line repeatedly, right? By putting so much in necessity. I think hopes that this will be the last war that forms the multipolar world, right? That there won't be a China war because everything can be settled here with a humiliating defeat leading to some new security architecture that's agreed upon that will even bring in China and everyone else. I don't think that's possible at all.
George,
I have to say.
Will they accept a humiliating defeat? That's what really worries me. George, can the West accept a humiliating defeat? Can it accept that NATO has been defeated or at least humiliated? That's what I have
serious
That was
doubts.
my question, by the way, to Dmitry Medvedev in November.
Yeah, I have serious doubts that the West would accept that. I think the West would absolutely refuse to cede defeat, above all defeat to Russia. They regard Russia as being weaker, inferior to them, and that would be really irksome. Even China, at least, they might have a little more respect for, because China, it's a big power, it's a big economy, and so on. So Russia, they really don't have respect for, so they would not accept you. And even if, let's say we come to the point where Russia marches on inexorably, wins this, and decisively defeats Ukraine, the West, NATO, will mobilize all the more firmly and all the more aggressively against Europe's leaders. Well, this will be what they've been dreaming about in a way. Now they can really mobilize their publics. They can then impose all of their draconian laws, and free speech and everything. All that's part of the kind of global coalition to thwart Russian aggression. So even if that happens, that Ukraine collapses and Russia, decides to invade.
What will happen if Ukraine actually does become a member of NATO? I mean, everyone always says there'll be a war, but how? Why? Why would there be a war? Why would there suddenly be a war?
Mark?
Because Russia would go to a war to prevent
Absolutely.
that. Russia would not allow NATO troops, NATO missiles, NATO anything to be placed in Ukraine. If they suddenly declared tomorrow that Ukraine under the Kiev regime is part of NATO, Russia would continue the war until there was no Ukraine left.
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Joan. Can't hear you, John.
My apologies. So NATO would, so Putin would effectively create a forever war until NATO.
No, it would be
leaves
NATO.
Ukraine.
A NATO.
Yeah, I mean,
forever.
I think NATO would be
NATO
would be generating the NATO war by that. But I mean, I think the forever war started in 2014, right? I don't expect peace and stability to be restored completely to Ukraine in my lifetime.
Yes.
Okay, well, at this point, I think it's important to push back a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. Probably they can't sustain it forever. I would think that they could sustain it for a few more years. I think that this will be they could continue. United States and everybody else and all their coalition of the willing will go on throwing more and more military hardware into the war. So go on underwriting Ukraine's debts. It could go on, I think, for a few more years. I don't know, how many years, but absolutely, I think they could continue like this.
Yeah,
for 5 years.
4 or 5 years is possible, depending on how we're defining war. So first of all, the 18 to 25-year-old demographic can still be drafted, even considering if half that population then escapes, through evading console. That can still add another 200,000 troops. The Kiev regime continually talks about conscripting women. That's something that has been brought up repeatedly. So yeah, the big thing is that Ukraine is very big, and people lose sight of that. If Russia has to go town to town, city to city, clearing every single building it can take a very long time. And it will consume an enormous amount of Russian resources to do it. That's an enormous amount of troops. And Russia will then have to rebuild Ukraine. How? Russia doesn't have that money, right? I mean, it's an enormous amount of money, and China is not going to just give it. This is very bad for Russia. It's not a good thing, right? There is no pretty victory for Russia here. There is only least bad of bad options.
Okay.
And
Mark,
then there'll be a guerrilla
when he left
war.
the meeting, yeah, absolutely. But Mark, when Zelensky left the White House meeting, he gave an interview with Putin. How do you read that? I mean, is it just more make-believe theater?
Sure, he's just responding to what Trump was pushing during.
So the whole thing
like
is
complete
make-believe. Everyone is playing a make-believe game, but if that's the case, we will surely know pretty soon. We will surely know that it's make-believe.
Yeah,
I don't know, because people have repeatedly, since before Trump office, continued with some kind of hope that Trump would bring this to an end somehow, that there would be peace, that there would be an agreement. Hope. I don't know. To me, hope is the death of analysis. I don't do hope. Maybe that leads to.
I'm not doing hope either. But the shift in the language is remarkable. Trump said there will be territorial. There could be territorial exchanges. The Europeans, having ruled that out, then all went, as Putin said, wagging their tails to the master, as if he hadn't said it. Same thing with no negotiations without a ceasefire. But Zelensky himself said it, and that is remarkable.
Well, I mean,
but if your view is, Mark, that it's just all lies.
It's words. It's just words. What does it mean? Things continue. The war continues on the battle.
Russia leaves. That's the territorial discussions that they have. I mean, Zelensky only speaks because he has the backing of the Europeans and a good part of the American foreign policy establishment. He has more resources than a lot of people claim.
There's also the issue that when they talk about these territorial concessions, they're very careful to say, oh, de facto. Now, what does that mean, de facto? It means we're going to start up the war whenever we feel like it in 3, 4, 5, 10 years' time. So that's why this is we talk about Minsk III. So they say, oh, yeah, okay, well, like de facto, remember what we did with the Baltic states. But that's why they're talking about, yeah, de facto we'll accept that this is where the Russian lines are, but we've got the security guarantees, and once we've got the security guarantees, then we're going to start rearming Ukraine. We're going to start replacing all the military hardware that's been destroyed. We're going to start retraining and reorganizing this military for the relaunch of the war. And why not? Since we haven't accepted these territorial losses de jure, then it's just a preparation for that. So that's why I think when they talk about, yeah, we'll discuss these territorial changes with Putin, they just mean, we'll accept it de facto, which means, in effect, we don't accept it.
Well, John, does the body politic of Europe, because we're talking about 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, where is the average European citizen in all of this? Or are they just certainly not denied any kind of role? I mean, because this conflict has impacted their economies, and it will continue to do so. I mean, is that a category that we should consider, or has it just been put on ice and these European elites don't care?
I don't think it's a category that enters into the calculations or into the equation at all, for all kinds of reasons. I mean, there are many issues on which public opinion is ignored. Immigration is one of them. There's no reason why war shouldn't be another. Of course, it has a very negative effect. But if you take the case of Britain, I would say public opinion would not be unfavorable to a war. The British love a good war. They've been fighting wars for decades, if not centuries. They always win them in their own eyes. So why not another one? They'll win this one as well. So I don't think there'll be much pressure in Britain. In France, there is opposition from the opposition parties in Parliament to sending troops. And I think that is a factor worth considering, because Macron prances around in his, that's all he does these days, is just go to various foreign meetings. But he doesn't have control of Parliament. And there is opposition to sending French troops, for example. So it's not at all clear that that would go through. Germany, I suppose, is a slightly different case. I think there would be a certain peace movement in Germany, but ultimately these are parliamentary regimes, and if the majority in Parliament agrees, and of course the political class is largely bought in all of these countries, then there's not really very much that public opinion can do, and certainly the elites, as you well know, Peter, are, and as indeed I think George and Mark have just said, are of course totally gearing up for more war. I mean, I think, George, it was you who said, well, certainly, I forget which one of you said it, but you both said that, they just want to rearm Ukraine, and even the security guarantees are just more aggression and so on. We might add to that the fact that the European Commission and the Council of Europe are setting up, together with Ukraine, a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. This is to be a Ukrainian court, but with international backing. So from the Council of Europe with 47 members, and from the European Commission with 27 members. Now, you can't possibly have a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia if Ukraine is going to then prosecute Russia for aggression. That would, by the way, George, only add to the de facto, de jure question of any theoretical, hypothetical cession of territory, because if in 3 or 4 years' time this amazing special tribunal should, by some amazing miracle, conclude that Russia had indeed been guilty of aggression, then of course the Ukrainians would say, well, there you are, this land is ours. But this, I mentioned this tribunal because it hasn't been much discussed. We've talked about security guarantees and territorial exchange and so on. It's a bit under the radar in the commentary. And yet it's absolutely key because at the time of the Minsk agreements, 2014, 2015, the Minsk agreement, the second one, possibly the first one as well, but definitely the second one, said that there should be no legal procedures, no prosecutions for anybody in the Donbass or anybody else. Meanwhile, at the same time, Ukraine was bringing the International Criminal Court into play and saying that the International Criminal Court had to prosecute the terrorists in the Donbass and various Russian officials. So Ukraine was talking out of two sides of its mouth in that period. It was saying one thing at Minsk and another thing to The Hague. And this is very similar to what's happening now. They've created this tribunal, but at the same time, they're talking the language of peace. So in other words, and as I say, with European backing, in other words, this shows that indeed the Europeans and probably the Ukrainians as well have absolutely no intention of making peace whatever.
But John, this is very similar, as you know, to what happened after the wars in Yugoslavia, when they absolutely made, front and center of all the agreements, particularly on Bosnia and Herzegovina, about everyone must cooperate with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which meant that the wars would continue. You could just simply say, draw a line under the sand, as they did in South Africa. You have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then you say, okay, that's it. We don't want to rehash the past, and we'll move on. That's the exact opposite. No. We want to rehash the past because we want to go on prosecuting this war against you by other means. And so in a way, this is what they're doing here. Oh, yeah, so it's just a tribunal. No, we're going to continue with this war against Russia.
Where does Trump
go ahead.
stand in all of this? Because we're talking, what the media is hyper attentive to, the daily news flow. But you gentlemen have talked about 3 years, 4 years, 10 years. Well, Donald Trump will be long gone. What's going to happen in the next 3.5 years of his presidency? I mean, for his followers, how many wars, George, has he solved? 8 now or something like that?
I think it was seven last time counting, but it could be 8 by today. So, yeah.
Well, it could be 8 in a corner of the world that we've never heard of. But more seriously, Mark and George, Trump is putting a lot of capital on this bet more than anything else. I mean, where are we going to be 6 weeks, 6 months from now?
Watching the Trump show.
Yeah.
It's a serial. It's a series, right? Okay.
As the multipolar world unfolds, and we see, for example, China wanting to take back Hong Kong and who knows, possibly Taiwan in the future. We know Trump has set a few sights on Taiwan also as some sort of proxy against China. Do you think Putin would like to see a union of the Soviets again?
Not in those terms. No. Russia and China, I mean, they're both very happy with the strategic partnership they have. I think there's a degree of cooperation, intelligence exchange going on that is beyond what most people think. But they still don't want their hands tied by formal treaty alliances. They're getting along very well as it is. And the situation isn't where NATO invades Russia and we would see Chinese troops traversing Russia to the European front. No, as you pointed out, if that happened, then they would go to restore Taiwan to complete Chinese control, because that would open a two-front war. That's the way the two powers assist each other, not directly, but through complementary actions in defiance of hegemony. That's where they operate. And I mean, back to the question of Trump. Every time anything that occurs with Trump, particularly by his diplomacy and governance by social media, right? This puerile the lowest common denominator social media posts. He's a speed bump that everyone on both sides just maneuvers around and manipulates. His own former officials, John Bolton, openly bragged about how he was manipulated out of any idea of some kind of détente with North Korea. If you've seen the film Gladiator, the original, where Maximus is in the amphitheater, and after defeating his opponent, he turns to the crowd and he says, "Are you not entertained? Is that not why you are here? Are you not entertained?" That is Trump. I mean, everything is performative. Everything is, but ultimately, he doesn't matter. He really doesn't. He's just something. We all consume ourselves. What is Trump thinking? What is Trump doing? It is the institutions of the U.S. government. It is the Congress. It is the blob, the deep state, the State Department, the military-industrial complex. All of these things, they just work at maneuvering him into the position they want, however he attempts to shift out of it.
Yeah, but Mark, he was elected, and quite decisively.
What does that mean?
That has no consequences at the end of the day.
I don't. I'm extremely cynical about democracy and any idea of citizen.
Well, so am I. But I mean, but you were talking about institutions. Institutionally, he was elected. What I'm just saying is, it was again. I'm largely in agreement with you guys, but I feel somebody has to push back for argument's sake. Okay.
I think that's. Go
ahead, George. Go ahead.
I agree with you, Peter. I think it's a striking feature, I think, of Trump. He really doesn't want to give up on somehow bringing an agreement to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that's a different issue whether he'll succeed or not. But you notice, I mean, Marco Rubio, he's very good at channeling Trumpian talking points. He's much smoother than Trump, so he can articulate the Trump view much better than Trump himself can. But and every time he was pressed on these talk shows, what about the sanctions? Isn't it time to introduce sanctions? Oh, well, what about the ceasefire? Don't you need to have a ceasefire right now? What about putting more pressure on Putin? What about doing that? We got to get tough with Putin. These are always a question. And every time he's asked this, he always says, well, that maybe we'll be forced to do that down the road. But once that happens, then that's the end of the peace process. Then that's the end of any attempt to bring this war to an end. And I think that's Trump's way of thinking, that if he does this, if he imposes all these 100% or 500% tariffs, or if he imposes further sanctions against Russia, then that's the end. And then he's basically gone down the Biden road, and there's no hope at all for anything. So he's going to try to avoid making any of these commitments for as long as possible. I mean, he may not succeed, but I think he will want to keep this door open for as long as possible, that he can actually get this deal done.
But you're saying that is because of his own personal vanity and not because it's in the American
I don't know whether it's vanity. I mean, I really don't think he has any hostility towards Russia. I mean, I think ultimately it does go back to his views for the 80s and 90s. He's always had quite benevolent attitudes towards Russia and to the Soviet Union. I think he wanted to do business deals in the Soviet Union back in the day. I think he wanted to to befriend Russian leaders from Gorbachev and Yeltsin. I think he's never had any of that kind of visceral hatred for Russia or the Soviet Union, come to that, that most of the rest of the foreign policy elite and the media in the United States have.
So essentially, I'll throw this to Mark. If we follow through in the argument, partially yours and what George just said here, is that the deep state, if we want to use that term, I don't care. They're embracing Trump because they know they'll eventually get what they will get what they want.
Sure. I mean, they're confident. They manipulated him during his first administration. They're confident that they can do the same now. That ultimately, I mean, people come to him with policy options. Something happens, people come in with policy options. And it's, hey, choose A, B, or C, right? And of course, it's a rigged game. They all ultimately lead, inevitably to the end. That's the way, it's not like Trump has some great well of knowledge, right, that allows him to push back on this. And by all accounts, in person, he's not usually bombastic or combative, but is usually trying to please people when he's in personal agreement with them. So, I mean, everyone is playing the game of manipulating Trump, and I mean, it will be decided on the battlefield, but that is not the end of the story, because if you will remember that Russia won the war on the battlefield in Syria, but there was no acceptance of loss by the West, by Turkey, all right, maybe by the GCC. They actually seem to have given up. Maybe not Qatar, but everyone else. But Russia lost the peace, and now Syria is, another Islamic State. I mean, literally led by someone who led the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in Syria, and the West completely embraces them. And ultimately, of course, that will lead to the fracturing of Syria permanently as a state. I mean, that's over. But Russia
hasn't yet won the war in Ukraine.
No, they haven't, and they're still a long way from winning the war, whatever winning means in this conflict.
Why is it so slow?
Modern warfare. Modern warfare. I mean, first of all, Russia's fighting all of NATO. Let's be perfectly honest about this. NATO generals are directing this war, right, out of Reichsbaden in Germany, right? All of NATO's resources and all the resources of all major NATO allies have been exhausted. Russia has attrited through all of them. But the nature of modern warfare is that with drones, with 24/7 satellite and drone reconnaissance, means that you can't critically mass troops, because with drones and other high precision weapons, they are immediately targeted. They're discovered as they try to critically mass. This prevents any type of large scale Jedi art maneuver warfare or anything, that the Western generals, just fantasize about. It's the nature of modern, or if you want to call it new warfare, because it is the first real war. I mean, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but that was just like an appetizer. This is a new type of war, and everything after this, right, that involves major conflict between major powers at an industrial scale will develop on from this. I mean, drones, artificial intelligence, all of this is the day-to-day reality of the battlefield now, and it's only becoming more so every day, right? Russia is on to producing 1,000, maybe 2,000 Garan long-range strike drones a day. I mean, just think about that. That's insane. But you still have to occupy territory physically with infantry, and that is a limitation. It's not. Russia is taking many less losses in terms of KIA than people think. Right. And actually, there's a lot less troops involved in direct encounter battles on the contact line than people think, simply because of the nature of this new modern warfare that they're fighting. But it is by its nature slow and tedious. And as long as the Kiev regime is financially backed and militarily backed by the West, even with diminishing military resources flowing into it, this can be a very slow, grinding, painful process. Now, the Russian military is getting stronger day to day, right? The Kiev regime military is getting weaker. The Russian military is getting stronger. But Ukraine is very, very big. And Russia has to occupy every hamlet, every town, every house, every apartment building.
Could I just ask, Mark? I mean, what you just said, about the modern warfare, point well taken. But you also said you do need the infantry to occupy territories, and you gain territory, but you need to occupy it. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to counteroffensive. Does Russia have the manpower to occupy territory short of a full mobilization? Is the current sort of level of mobilization, is that sufficient for Russia's manpower needs?
Russia is capable of taking definitely the Donbass and probably Kherson and Zaporozhye and maybe the east of the Dnieper, including a Kharkov region, without a further with just the simple volunteer contract soldiers, right? We're looking at nearly a million people already invested just as volunteer contract soldiers in that. But if there is a need to go further because the West will not accept defeat into Kiev, into Western Ukraine, then there will have to be further calling up of reservists. And Russia has enough reservists without calling into the general population. That has to be said. Russia still has some 2 million reservists that they're capable of calling up. That is enough. That would be enough. But of course, that would lead to increased, managing of the domestic political situation at home, because there would be more objection, because lots of people out of the military with families and kids and whatnot would be called up. But again, it's important to understand how much smaller Russian casualties are than the Kiev regime casualties. Sure. They're being incredibly cautious. And that's one of the reasons why it's taking so long as well, is that Russia, all this meat wave nonsense, it's complete caricature propaganda. It wasn't even true largely in the World War II. It wasn't even true then, and it's certainly not true now. It's just the death of Western journalism.
Mark, in this current news cycle, it's been revealed that Russian hackers made it into databases of tell the story and tell me what you think about it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so supposedly, the databases that the Kiev regime military has of what their real casualties are have been hacked by the Russians, and they've put out very specific numbers. And, at the end of the day, I'm not qualified to assess whether they're real. But when we're talking dead and missing, the numbers the Russians are pushing forward is 1.7 million. And when you consider how many people have been conscripted and how many Kiev regime forces are manning the contact line today, it doesn't seem that impossible.
Well, it's more than what the Russian Defense Ministry, they said 1.07, I think was the number I read this morning. And so, and a lot of people thought that was a gross exaggeration. But now, if this hack is valid, then the Russians have underestimated it. And of course,
that 1.7 million missing would be what the Kiev regime considers deserters as well. So if you add in another 400, 500, 600,000 deserters onto that, then that number actually matches up pretty well.
And what do we think the Russian figures are?
Around 120,000 KIA.
Yeah.
And we know that because BBC funded Media Zona, which is very good at sniffing out any dead soldier, in Russia through their own access into Russian, shall we say, military bureaucracy. They're staking out of cemeteries. They're visiting soldiers' families. They're very, very good. They can't find more than 120,000.
Mark, we're rapidly running out of time. We both live here. What is your sense? On this program, probably unlike almost any other program on the internet, is that there's a consensus here that this is far from over. Does Russia have the wherewithal to continue the conflict? And what about public opinion? You already mentioned, it's putting a lot of stress on certain families. And I'd like to point out, and maybe Mark will disagree with me, again, the less privileged are fighting this war. And that is a theme that is mentioned among people here. What are your thoughts? Wherewithal?
Well, there's actually a number of Russian MPs, right, of Duma members that are there fighting as well, and their families. So I don't think I don't think you see that certainly on the Kiev regime side, their families are mostly safe from conscription in Europe and the United States. I think the Russian public supports the war now. In fact, I think they would react negatively to some type of concessions made to the U.S. But let's talk again in another year or two of war and see where things are. Economically, everything is fine right now, but that's not necessarily guaranteed 2 years down the road.
Fair.
Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating listening to you, Mark, and also to you, George. I suppose I agree with you. I think, in a way, it's I guess what's difficult is to imagine that this bluster and this make-believe and this random lashing out that we get from Trump, and in a very different way from the Europeans, because they are also capable of saying one thing and the opposite. I mentioned Mark Rutte at the beginning. Rutte, who not only said it was our war and now says that that Trump has made a great breakthrough for peace, but who also started to talk about a week ago, I think 10 days ago, about de facto recognition of Russian occupation of territory. That's also a form of make-believe, just literally to say one thing and then its opposite. But it seems surely in a war situation, make-believe can't really work for that long. Surely the whole point about war is that reality breaks in eventually. And will there be, if everything you say about the Russians not accepting, for instance, security guarantees and so on is true, then perhaps we should simply expect that Russia says no.
Well, I mean, John, talking about magical thinking, if Americans do not believe that they're paying the cost, and if the Europeans don't believe they're paying the cost, I think Mark would agree with me. Among Russians, this is a righteous cause. Magical thinking can go on for a long time.
Did for 20 years in Afghanistan.
No, I think that's it. And I think both the Europeans and the Americans, they haven't really paid much of a price. They haven't lost any lives, or at least, as far as we can tell. They've paid a certain economic price, but it hasn't caused the economic dislocations and distress that it was predicted that they would cause. They haven't done that. So from their point of view, they can say, yeah, we can go on fighting this because we're not really suffering. We're inflicting the suffering on them, the Russians, obviously on the Ukrainians, but they don't really care very much about the Ukrainians. As long as we're inflicting suffering on the Russians, yeah, why not? We're not really paying any serious price.
Yeah, the Afghan precedent is very arresting. After all, that, if I remember correctly, that ended up costing 2 trillion over 20 years. So we're a long way from 2 trillion.
Afghanistan and Iraq, 3.1 trillion.
Yeah, okay. So we're a long way from that yet. Ukraine is cheap by comparison so far.
And Ukrainian.
So there we are. You've given the right answer, Mark.
Ukrainian life is cheap.
We can spin this out for another 2 decades. Golly, what a conclusion. Well, listen, thank you very much indeed, Mark Sleboda and George Samueli, and co-host Peter Lavelle and Jeremy Nell. I'm sure we'll return to this theme soon enough. Thank you for your time. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.